The airport was bustling with life, filled with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, intercom announcements, and the low murmur of passengers chatting as they waited for their flights. People hurried past each other, some trying to make their connections, some moving at a more leisurely pace, enjoying the start of a journey. Among them, a flight attendant prepared for another routine flight, moving with a calm confidence that came from years of experience. She adjusted her uniform, checked her watch, and took a moment to look around at the passengers boarding her plane. She had seen all kinds of travelers over the years. There were people in a hurry, rushing to grab the last-minute snacks or to find their seats. There were families juggling luggage and children, trying to settle in before takeoff. There were solo travelers, quietly observing the world around them, headphones in, lost in their own thoughts. And then there were passengers like one man she noticed immediately, already talking loudly on his phone as he approached the boarding gate, completely absorbed in his conversation. The man seemed oblivious to the world around him. He gestured with one hand while holding the phone to his ear with the other, laughing and reacting to the person on the other end of the line. People tried to sidestep him politely as he moved down the aisle, but he continued in his own world, unaware of the subtle annoyance he was causing. The flight attendant observed him calmly, making a mental note of his behavior. She had learned over time that these situations required patience and a gentle approach rather than confrontation. Passengers began boarding the plane, taking their seats and settling in. The cabin was a mixture of calm and mild chaos as people stowed luggage, found their seats, and buckled up. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, greeting passengers with warm smiles and soft words. She checked that everyone had settled in properly, helped a few with overhead bags, and offered reassurance to those who seemed nervous about flying. Her movements were smooth and practiced, designed to make the cabin feel safe, welcoming, and comfortable. The man on the phone finally reached his seat in the middle section. He barely looked around as he fumbled with his luggage, continuing his conversation without pause. Other passengers nearby tried to ignore him, but it was difficult. His voice carried easily across the aisle, and his gestures were animated, drawing subtle glances from those around him. The flight attendant noticed the tension, but she remained composed. She knew that approaching him directly while he was on the phone could backfire, so she decided to observe for now, waiting for a natural opportunity to engage. The cabin lights were dimmed slightly, creating a soft, calming atmosphere. The engines roared gently as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened their seatbelts, and tried to relax for the journey ahead. Some read books, others scrolled on their phones, and a few simply stared out the window, watching the clouds shift and change as the plane moved across the tarmac. The flight attendant moved down the aisle again, ensuring that seatbelts were fastened correctly and that all passengers were comfortable. As the plane took off, the cabin filled with a low vibration and the familiar hum of the engines. Passengers gripped their armrests lightly, some with excitement, others with a hint of anxiety. The flight attendant walked the aisle with a gentle smile, offering comfort and reassurance where needed. She checked that the man on the phone had properly secured his seatbelt. He continued talking, occasionally glancing around as if finally noticing the cabin for the first time, but quickly returning to his conversation. The smell of fresh coffee and snacks began to fill the cabin as the crew prepared for service. The flight attendant moved toward the small kitchen area, organizing the trays and checking that everything was in place. She noticed the man tapping his foot impatiently while talking on the phone. It was clear he was a little restless, distracted, and possibly hungry. She knew from experience that hunger and distraction could make even calm passengers uneasy, and she began to consider a subtle way to engage him without causing embarrassment or confrontation. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the crew began preparing for the snack and beverage service. The flight attendant arranged items on the cart carefully, checking that everything was fresh and ready. She had a small tray of garlic bread that had just been prepared, its aroma warm and inviting. She thought about how a small gesture could create a positive moment, a connection that would make the passenger feel seen and appreciated. She decided to wait for the right moment to approach him, hoping that offering a simple snack could encourage him to pause his conversation and engage with the environment around him. The passengers began to settle more fully into the flight. Some reclined slightly, closing their eyes or adjusting pillows. Others conversed quietly with neighbors. The flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, offering water and juice, checking if anyone needed blankets or other small comforts. When she reached the man's row, she slowed down, observing him carefully. He was still on the phone, laughing and gesturing, but there was a slight tension in his posture, a restless energy that suggested he could use a small moment of care. She paused for a moment, letting the presence of the cart and the aroma of warm garlic bread make a gentle impression. The man finally glanced at her and noticed the tray of food. His eyes widened slightly and he hesitated, still holding the phone. The flight attendant smiled warmly, waiting patiently. Her calm, non-intrusive demeanor invited him to pause without forcing him. It was a subtle balance, an art of human interaction that she had perfected over many flights. Passengers nearby noticed the small exchange, but they did not interfere. They seemed to sense the quiet patience and care in the interaction. The man's attention shifted briefly from his conversation to the bread, and he seemed surprised by the offer. The flight attendant waited, allowing him the space to make a choice without pressure or judgment. She had learned that these moments often required patience. Rushing or confronting a passenger could create tension rather than connection. Finally, the man placed his phone down for a moment and looked at the flight attendant. "Garlic bread?" he asked, a bit surprised but clearly curious. She nodded, holding the tray slightly forward. "Yes, it's fresh and warm. I thought you might enjoy a little snack," she said softly, her tone friendly and reassuring. The man smiled, a small but genuine expression of appreciation, and accepted a piece of bread. The warmth of the food and the thoughtfulness of the gesture seemed to relax him immediately. He took a small bite, chewing slowly and savoring the taste. The flight attendant stepped back slightly, allowing him to enjoy the moment without intrusion. Passengers nearby exchanged quiet smiles, noticing the subtle shift in energy. The cabin felt lighter, calmer, more human. A small gesture, a piece of garlic bread offered with genuine attention, had created a ripple of positive energy that touched everyone around. As the man enjoyed the snack, he glanced at the flight attendant and offered a quiet, "Thank you." It was not just for the bread, but for the attention and care behind the action. The flight attendant smiled, knowing that she had created a meaningful human connection in the midst of an ordinary flight. She moved on to continue her rounds, attending to other passengers, her presence calm, attentive, and reassuring. The plane continued on its journey, the steady rhythm of engines and the quiet murmur of passengers creating a peaceful atmosphere. The man, now more relaxed, observed the other passengers for the first time, noticing small gestures and interactions he had previously overlooked. He realized that being present, even in a small way, made the experience of the flight more enjoyable. The flight attendant continued her careful rounds, offering comfort and service with a natural, human touch that elevated the entire environment. Passengers began to settle fully, enjoying the scenery, the comfort of their seats, and the quiet interactions that made flying less stressful. The man finished the garlic bread, leaning back slightly in his seat, his earlier restlessness replaced by calm. He glanced out the window at the clouds, taking a moment to breathe and enjoy the view. The flight attendant, observing the shift, felt a quiet satisfaction. She knew that even small gestures offered with patience and kindness could create lasting impressions. As the plane moved further along its route, the atmosphere in the cabin remained calm and human-centered. Passengers were relaxed, conversations were soft, and the flight attendant continued her rounds, attentive to every detail. She checked if anyone needed water, adjusted blankets, and offered a friendly smile wherever it was needed. The man, now fully engaged in the present, glanced at her with appreciation, recognizing the impact of her thoughtful gestures. By the end of the first part of the flight, the cabin had transformed from a space of mild tension and distraction into one of calm, presence, and subtle human connection. The flight attendant had successfully engaged the man with a small act of kindness, and the ripple effects were evident in the relaxed demeanor of nearby passengers. She continued to move gracefully through the aisle, attentive, patient, and aware of the human experiences unfolding around her. The man, finishing the last bite of garlic bread, realized that the flight could be more than just a journey from one place to another. It could be an experience of connection, awareness, and subtle joy. He leaned back in his seat, feeling the warmth of the cabin and the care of the flight attendant, and for the first time, he truly began to enjoy the flight. The plane had reached a smooth cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines created a soft, constant background noise. The cabin lights were dimmed just enough to make it comfortable for the passengers. People were settling into their little worlds, some reading, some dozing off, and others quietly chatting with companions. The flight attendant moved slowly down the aisle, checking on everyone, her eyes attentive to little details that most people might overlook. She had learned over the years that flying was more than just moving people from one place to another. It was about understanding moods, reading expressions, and sometimes even offering a little extra care when needed. As she passed the rows, she noticed a man in the middle section who seemed completely absorbed in his phone conversation. His voice was loud enough to carry over the gentle background music of the cabin, though not intentionally rude. He laughed. He gestured with his free hand, and at one point he leaned back in his seat so far that his seatbelt stretched across him awkwardly. Other passengers tried to ignore him, some politely, others with thinly veiled annoyance. The flight attendant observed quietly, making mental notes. She wasn't there to police phone etiquette, but she knew that attention needed to be given. The man looked restless. His hand tapped on the armrest, and his leg bounced up and down as if the call he was having was more than just a casual chat. He glanced around once or twice, not out of awareness but more out of distraction, before returning to his animated conversation. The flight attendant saw that he had not touched the small packet of snacks in front of him, which was standard for this kind of flight. She wondered if he had eaten anything yet. Hunger often made people irritable, she thought, and maybe it was adding to the tension in the air. She approached him with the kind of calm confidence that came with experience. She didn't want to interrupt, and she certainly didn't want to appear confrontational. She knew there were ways to handle situations like this that left both parties feeling respected. She gave a gentle smile and waited a moment, pretending to check the row ahead while subtly observing his behavior. It was clear he was absorbed, not intentionally being rude, but simply caught up in his world. She could sense that a small, kind intervention might shift the energy of the moment. Other passengers were starting to glance his way. Some rolled their eyes, some sighed softly, and some tried to focus on their screens or books, hoping not to notice. The atmosphere in that section was slightly tense but not unbearable. The flight attendant knew that small gestures often diffused these situations faster than words could. She decided to prepare her snack cart in a way that would allow her to engage naturally, almost casually. There was a tray of warm garlic bread on the cart, just baked and smelling wonderfully inviting. She had a feeling it could work as an icebreaker. She moved down the aisle, smiling at passengers, offering water and juice, checking if anyone needed blankets or pillows. When she reached the man's row, she slowed down just a little, making her presence known but not intrusive. She could see him talking and gesturing, still unaware of the world beyond his phone. She waited for a pause in his conversation, which came only briefly when he laughed and covered his mouth with his hand. "That looks really good," he muttered almost to himself, glancing at the small snack packet in front of him, but he didn't reach for it. The flight attendant took a small breath and leaned slightly toward him, just enough to be noticed. She didn't want to startle him or force him off the call. "Would you like some garlic bread?" "It's fresh and just came out of the oven," she said softly, holding the tray slightly forward. The man froze for a moment. His phone call didn't end, but his attention shifted. He turned his head and saw the tray of golden steaming bread. The smell hit him almost immediately, warm and inviting, making his stomach rumble a little. He hesitated, caught between continuing the call and acknowledging the offer. The flight attendant gave him a gentle nod and a small smile, a quiet patience that spoke louder than any words. He could sense she wasn't in a hurry and wasn't judging him for being on the phone. He laughed awkwardly, a little embarrassed. Sure, I guess. Yeah, garlic bread sounds good," he said, his voice softer now. He glanced around, noticing that a few passengers were watching, but not in an annoyed way anymore. They were curious, some even smiling subtly at the interaction. The flight attendant carefully placed a warm piece of garlic bread on a small plate and handed it to him. "Here you go. Enjoy," she said, her voice light, friendly, and unhurried. As he took the bread, he paused his call fully for the first time, just long enough to take a bite. The warmth and flavor seemed to surprise him, and a genuine smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his seat slightly, chewing thoughtfully, savoring the taste. He looked up at the flight attendant with an expression of appreciation, almost like a silent thank you. She returned the smile with quiet satisfaction. then moved along to attend to other passengers. Knowing the little intervention had already changed the mood in that section of the plane, he glanced around, noticing that the subtle tension in the air had lifted. Other passengers were now reading or scrolling through their devices more peacefully. A few even exchanged small smiles, acknowledging the shift. The flight attendant watched from a few rows ahead, keeping an eye on him. She knew that sometimes the smallest gestures, a piece of food, a kind word, a patient pause, could change the way people felt and interacted. The man took another bite, now more relaxed, and chuckled softly into his phone. He wasn't completely done with his conversation, but his tone had changed. He was speaking more calmly, more thoughtfully. Even the gestures of his hands were slower, more measured. It was clear that the small act of receiving the garlic bread had given him a pause, a moment to reset in the midst of his busy, distracted day. The flight attendant moved back down the aisle, checking in on other passengers with the same care and attention. She offered water, adjusted pillows, and gave small smiles that brightened the atmosphere. She noticed that people were more relaxed now, the cabin feeling warmer, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of the little interactions that made flying human. Small things, attention, kindness, patience, made the difference between a stressful flight and a memorable one. Meanwhile, the man continued to enjoy his bread, and after finishing, he put his phone aside for a moment. He looked around, noticing the other passengers for the first time, seeing their faces without distraction. He caught the eye of a young child sitting a few rows away who waved shyly. He waved back, something he wouldn't have done earlier, too absorbed in his phone. He felt lighter, more connected to the people around him, simply because someone had cared enough to notice him and offer something small but meaningful. By the time the flight attendant returned for her next round, she found him smiling genuinely, fully engaged in the experience of the flight rather than just the conversation on his phone. She didn't need to speak to him again. Her presence and the little act of offering the garlic bread had already done the work. He nodded in her direction as she passed by, a silent acknowledgement of appreciation that needed no words. As she continued down the aisle, she reflected quietly on the moment. Life in the air was full of brief encounters, tiny exchanges that could leave lasting impressions. The man who had been so distracted and unknowingly disruptive had now found a little peace and even a smile, simply because someone had noticed and cared. In her experience, this was what made her job meaningful. Not just serving food or ensuring safety, but creating connections, easing tension, and offering small comforts that mattered more than most people realized. The rest of the passengers in that section seemed calmer, happier, and more relaxed. Some whispered quietly to their companions about the friendly gesture they had witnessed, noting how a small act could change the energy around them. The flight attendant continued her work, delivering drinks and snacks, attending to needs with quiet efficiency and warmth. She knew that the simple human touch she brought into her work had ripple effects that went far beyond what anyone could see in the moment. The man returned to his phone call eventually, but now with a softer tone, less stress, and a newfound calm. Every so often he glanced down at the plate now empty with a small smile. He didn't need to speak about it out loud. The moment had already shifted his perspective. The flight attendant continued her rounds, noticing similar small interactions all over the cabin, each one reinforcing the truth that care, patience, and a little attention could make ordinary moments extraordinary. By the time the meal service ended, the atmosphere in that section had completely transformed. What had started as a slightly tense and distracted environment had turned into a calm, more connected space. Passengers were relaxed, chatting softly with companions, enjoying their own snacks or simply looking out the window at the clouds beneath them. The man, now fully immersed in the flight experience, seemed lighter, more present, and somehow appreciative of the small gesture that had altered his mood. It was a simple human moment, but one that carried weight far beyond the immediate scene. A warm piece of garlic bread, a friendly smile, and the patience to wait for the right moment had transformed a tense situation into something memorable and positive. The flight attendant continued her work, fully aware that this was why she loved her job. Not just for the routines and responsibilities, but for the little moments that connected her to the people she served in a genuine, human way. The flight had reached a calm rhythm, the soft hum of the engines blending with the occasional rustle of snack wrappers and the muted murmur of conversations. The passengers had mostly settled in, some reclining in their seats, some scrolling through phones, and others staring quietly out of the oval windows at the clouds below. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the cabin for any signs of discomfort or need. She enjoyed these moments when she could quietly notice things that others might overlook, small human details that often made the difference between an ordinary flight and a memorable one. When she reached the middle section, her attention returned to the man she had noticed earlier. He had finished the first piece of garlic bread she had offered him, and now there was a small, contented smile on his face. He had put his phone down briefly, enough to truly taste and appreciate the warm bread, and she could see a subtle shift in his energy. There was a change in posture, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Other passengers nearby also seemed to relax, no longer distracted by his earlier loud conversation. It was a small transformation, but she knew how powerful such moments could be. She moved closer, pushing the snack cart gently, making it part of the experience rather than just a tool for distributing food. The aroma of warm garlic bread filled the aisle, a comforting scent that made several passengers glance up with interest. She had a small tray of additional pieces prepared, knowing that for some people food was more than just sustenance. It was a connection, a reminder of comfort and care. She offered the tray to the man again, this time with a friendly suggestion. "Would you like another piece? It's fresh and I just baked it," she said softly. The man looked surprised for a moment, caught between continuing his phone call and acknowledging the gesture. He hesitated, then laughed softly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Sure, why not?" he said, placing his phone down fully for the first time. The flight attendant smiled warmly and handed him another piece of bread, still steaming from the oven. He took it carefully, almost reverently, as if he could sense the warmth and care behind the simple offering. As he took a bite, his expression shifted again. There was a quiet satisfaction, a small moment of joy that made him pause. He chewed slowly, savoring the taste, and for a few minutes the phone call was completely forgotten. The cabin seemed to breathe a little easier as well, the subtle tension from before now dissipating. Other passengers watched quietly, noticing how a small act of kindness had a noticeable effect. Some even whispered to their companions, commenting on the attentive service and the man's visible change in mood. The flight attendant moved along the aisle, offering snacks and drinks to other passengers, but she kept an eye on him. Aware that this was one of those moments where patience and attention could create a meaningful connection, she didn't rush or pressure him. Instead, she allowed the interaction to unfold naturally, letting him enjoy the simple pleasure of food and human interaction. The man, now fully present, smiled up at her as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude that needed no words. She noticed subtle details about him, the way his hands relaxed on the armrests, the way he sat back more comfortably, the way his eyes softened as he looked around the cabin. It was as if the small gesture of offering garlic bread had reminded him of something simple but profound, that someone cared, even in a place as impersonal as an airplane. The flight attendant knew that these moments didn't require grand gestures or dramatic speeches. They thrived on attention, kindness, and the quiet patience to notice another person's needs. The man finished the second piece of bread and leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. For the first time since the flight had begun, he seemed to relax fully. His phone remained on the seat beside him, untouched, as if he had temporarily left behind the urgency of the conversation he had been having. He glanced around the cabin and noticed the other passengers in a new light, seeing them not as strangers but as fellow travelers sharing the same journey. A soft smile appeared on his face, subtle but genuine. The flight attendant observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. She had seen countless passengers over the years, each with their own stories, their own worries, their own distractions. She knew that a little care, a simple gesture, could sometimes reach deeper than words. In this case, a warm piece of garlic bread had provided a bridge, a moment of connection, a pause in a busy world, a reminder of comfort and human kindness. As she continued her rounds, she noticed other small interactions unfolding. A child giggled quietly as a parent offered a snack. A young woman adjusted her blanket and smiled at a fellow passenger. An elderly couple exchanged a soft word of thanks for the assistance of a nearby attendant. All these moments, though seemingly insignificant, contributed to the atmosphere of the flight. The cabin felt lighter, warmer, more human, The flight attendant felt a quiet pride in knowing that her presence and attentiveness had played a part in shaping this environment. The man, now fully immersed in his own experience, finally picked up his phone again, but the tone of his voice had changed. It was calmer, more measured, less distracted. He spoke more thoughtfully, his gestures slower and less fidgety. The brief pause, the moment of quiet enjoyment with the garlic bread, had given him a chance to reset, to reconnect with the present. The flight attendant knew that these moments were rare but powerful, reminders that even small acts of consideration could create ripple effects beyond what anyone could immediately see. She continued down the aisle, offering drinks, adjusting pillows, checking in on passengers quietly and unobtrusively. She noticed the subtle shifts in mood, the little smiles, the relaxed posture, the quiet laughter. These were the markers of her work, the evidence that human connection, attention, and empathy mattered as much as safety procedures and service protocols. She didn't need recognition or thanks. The satisfaction came from seeing these small changes, knowing that she had made a difference in someone's day, in someone's experience, in someone's mood. The man took another small bite of garlic bread, this time with a more relaxed expression. He glanced around the cabin, noticing things he hadn't before: the patterns of the seats, the way the sunlight reflected through the windows, the gentle nods and smiles of passengers passing by. He felt more present, more aware, more connected to the people around him. The flight attendant moved on, allowing him this quiet moment of reflection and enjoyment, understanding that sometimes the best service was giving someone the space to experience life fully. Even in a confined space like an airplane cabin, other passengers now seemed to mirror this energy, their own moods softening, their interactions becoming lighter. A young couple whispered and laughed quietly over a shared snack. An older passenger offered a nod of thanks to a nearby crew member. A child pointed out something outside the window to a parent. The cabin had shifted almost imperceptibly, from a place of individual focus and mild tension to a space of shared experience, of subtle connection, of quiet, human warmth. The flight attendant moved back to her station near the front of the cabin, taking a moment to catch her breath and observe the overall atmosphere. She felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that her small action had contributed to this change. She reflected on how her job was not just about serving food or ensuring safety. It was about noticing, understanding, and responding to the human element in every situation. It was about patience, empathy, and the ability to read the room, to sense when someone needed a little extra care, and to provide it without expectation or judgment. The man, now finished with the bread, placed the empty plate on the small tray beside him and smiled faintly. He no longer seemed restless or distracted. He leaned back comfortably, finally returning to his phone with a sense of calm and presence that hadn't been there before. He occasionally glanced up at the flight attendant, offering a small, grateful nod each time their eyes met. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of recognition, appreciation, and human connection. The flight continued smoothly, the cabin filled with quiet murmurs, the occasional laugh, and the soft shuffle of people settling into their seats. The flight attendant moved methodically, attending to needs with quiet efficiency, yet always keeping her awareness tuned to the passengers. She knew that every interaction, every small gesture had the potential to shape the experience of the flight. A smile, a piece of bread, a patient pause, these were not just tasks. They were expressions of humanity, creating moments that passengers would remember long after the plane touched down. The man finally returned fully to his phone conversation, but now with a gentle, calmer tone. He gestured less, spoke more thoughtfully, and seemed less burdened by the urgency that had marked the earlier part of the flight. The flight attendant watched quietly, satisfied with the subtle transformation. She knew that it was not just the food, but the combination of care, timing, and attention that had made the difference. Sometimes she thought the smallest gestures carried the greatest impact. As she prepared for the next round of service, she reflected on the unfolding journey. Life at 30,000 feet was a unique microcosm of the world below, a place where small human interactions mattered, where empathy and patience could transform ordinary moments into something memorable. The man in the middle section, once distracted and restless, had now become a quieter, more engaged participant in the shared experience of flight. And all it had taken was a warm piece of garlic bread, offered with genuine care and attention. By the time she finished her round, the atmosphere in that part of the cabin had completely changed. There was a sense of calm, of connection, of shared humanity. The man leaned back in his seat, now fully present, enjoying the flight in a way he hadn't at the start. Other passengers exchanged quiet smiles and nods, acknowledging the shift without needing to speak. The flight attendant moved to the back of the plane, ready to attend to the next section, carrying the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a small, thoughtful gesture had created ripples that extended far beyond the moment itself. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm, the steady hum of the engines mixed with the soft murmur of passengers chatting or reading. The sunlight streamed gently through the windows, casting a warm glow on the seats in the aisle. The flight attendant moved carefully down the aisle, her eyes sweeping over the passengers, noticing small details that might otherwise go unnoticed. She had a way of blending into the background while still making her presence felt, a comforting smile here, a helpful hand there. Every movement was deliberate, not just about service but about creating a calm, human environment. When she reached the middle section again, her attention naturally returned to the man who had been on the phone earlier. He was now fully relaxed, leaning back in his seat, the plate of garlic bread empty, a quiet smile on his face. There was a new softness to his posture, a sense that he was finally present in the moment. The flight attendant observed this silently, appreciating the small but meaningful transformation. The passengers nearby seemed more comfortable as well, their eyes no longer flicking nervously toward the man's seat, the tension that had been there before now gone. The man shifted slightly, glancing at the flight attendant as she moved past. He didn't speak at first, but his eyes conveyed a subtle gratitude, a recognition of the effort and care she had shown. The flight attendant returned his gaze with a nod and a warm smile, acknowledging the moment without intrusion. She understood that this was part of her job too, the quiet connection, the acknowledgement of shared humanity, the small gestures that often went unspoken but were deeply felt. As she continued down the aisle, she checked on other passengers, offering drinks and small snacks. A few people requested water, another asked for a blanket, and a young child waved at her politely from a seat near the window. Each interaction, though brief, added to the calm human atmosphere she was helping to create. She moved with quiet efficiency, attentive but unobtrusive, aware that her presence set the tone for the cabin in ways that often went unnoticed but mattered deeply. The man took a deep breath, stretching slightly in his seat. He looked around the cabin, noticing details he hadn't seen before, the subtle design of the seats, the pattern of light on the aisle, the way passengers were quietly interacting with one another. He could feel the difference in the atmosphere, the gentle shift from tension to comfort. He glanced at the empty plate on the tray table and felt a small sense of satisfaction. Something as simple as garlic bread had given him a moment to pause, to reset, to step out of the constant stream of conversation and distraction that had dominated his morning. The flight attendant moved back toward him, carrying a small tray of fruit and a few other snacks. She smiled as she offered a few pieces of fruit to nearby passengers, making sure everyone felt attended to. When she reached his seat, she leaned slightly and said in a gentle voice, "Would you like some fruit as well?" "It's fresh, just prepared." The man looked at her a little surprised and then chuckled softly. "Sure, that sounds great," he replied, reaching out to accept the plate. He was now fully engaged with the simple joys of the flight, no longer distracted by his phone conversation or his restless energy. As he sampled the fruit, he glanced up at the flight attendant. "You have a really nice way of making people feel comfortable," he said, his tone sincere. He had been too distracted before to notice, but now he could see the effort and thought behind her actions. The flight attendant nodded modestly, offering only a smile in return. She didn't need praise. Her satisfaction came from the knowledge that her actions had created a positive experience, not just for him, but for the passengers around them. The atmosphere in the cabin continued to improve. Other passengers were smiling quietly, some exchanging soft words with neighbors, some simply watching the clouds outside the windows. The man, now relaxed and attentive, began noticing the little details of the flight. How neatly the seats were arranged, the way the light changed as the plane passed through the clouds, the small interactions between crew members and passengers. He realized that this flight, which had started with irritation and distraction, had become unexpectedly pleasant. A small act of care had shifted everything. The flight attendant moved on to the next row, checking if anyone needed assistance. She noticed an elderly woman struggling slightly with her bag in the overhead compartment and offered a hand without drawing attention to herself. The woman smiled gratefully and adjusted her bag with the flight attendant's help. These moments, repeated countless times over a long career, were what gave her the quiet confidence that she could make a difference even in small ways. She understood that flying was not just about reaching a destination, but about creating moments of calm, connection, and human warmth in the midst of travel. Back at the man's seat, he was now leaning back comfortably, the phone finally set aside. He watched as the flight attendant moved down the aisle, interacting with other passengers, offering care and attention in a way that was both professional and deeply human. He realized that he had been caught up in his own world, in distractions and phone conversations, and had almost missed the experience of the flight itself. Now, with the simple gesture of garlic bread and friendly attention, he felt more present, more aware, more connected. A young couple in the row behind him had been watching quietly. They whispered to each other, commenting on how nice it was to see such thoughtful service, noting how the man's mood had shifted. A small ripple of conversation passed through nearby passengers, each remark gentle and appreciative, acknowledging the positive atmosphere in the cabin. The man noticed this as well and felt a quiet satisfaction. He had contributed in some small way to the calm and friendly energy around him, simply by allowing himself to pause and engage with the present moment. The flight attendant returned with a few more small items for passengers, moving with quiet care. She checked if the man wanted anything else, but he shook his head with a smile, satisfied and content. "Thank you," he said softly. It wasn't a formal thank you, but the warmth in his voice and the gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. The flight attendant nodded and moved on, knowing that the impact of these interactions extended far beyond the immediate moment. She had created a small space of comfort, connection, and kindness that would linger in the memories of the passengers long after the flight ended. Time passed quietly. The clouds outside shifted and shimmered in the afternoon sun. The man watched, relaxed, noticing how beautiful the world could look from above. He took another small bite of fruit and let himself simply enjoy the moment. He reflected on how easy it had been to get caught up in distractions, to let phone conversations and busy schedules dominate his attention. Now he realized it was possible to slow down, to notice, to connect, even in small, simple ways. The flight attendant's thoughtful actions had given him a new perspective, reminding him that a little attention to the human experience could transform an ordinary day. Nearby passengers also seemed affected by the change in atmosphere. A child pointed excitedly out the window to a parent. A young woman laughed quietly at a shared joke with her companion. An elderly man nodded in appreciation to the crew as they passed. The cabin was no longer just a collection of strangers in close proximity. It had become a small shared community, connected through subtle interactions, small gestures, and the unspoken acknowledgement of care and presence. The flight attendant continued her rounds, moving with calm confidence, attentive to both visible and subtle needs. She adjusted blankets, offered drinks, checked if anyone needed assistance, and responded to quiet requests with patience and a smile. Each action, though small, contributed to the collective atmosphere of the flight, reinforcing the sense of comfort, connection, and human warmth. She understood that her role was not just about serving food or maintaining safety. It was about creating an environment where passengers felt seen, valued, and cared for. The man, now fully relaxed, glanced around once more. He noticed how the cabin seemed calmer, lighter, and more pleasant. The earlier tension and distraction were gone, replaced by a gentle, shared sense of calm. He reflected on the simple power of kindness and attention. Something as ordinary as garlic bread offered with genuine care had created a profound shift, not just in his mood, but in the mood of the passengers around him. It was a reminder that small acts performed with thoughtfulness could have effects far beyond what anyone might expect. The flight continued, smooth and uneventful, but with a renewed sense of human connection. The man occasionally glanced at the flight attendant, offering a small appreciative nod each time. The gesture, subtle and quiet, carried more meaning than words. He realized that he had been given not just food, but a moment of human understanding, a pause in the busy rush of life, and a chance to notice the people around him. The cabin, once merely a transit space, had transformed into a small haven of calm connection and shared humanity. The flight attendant, moving toward the rear of the plane to continue her rounds, felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had seen firsthand how a small act of kindness could shift the energy of a space, touch the hearts of passengers, and leave a lasting impression. Her work was more than a job. It was an opportunity to create small moments of joy, comfort, and connection in a world that often moved too fast. She smiled to herself, knowing that today she had made a difference not in grand gestures but in simple, human ways that mattered more than most people realized. The man leaned back, finally taking a moment to truly relax and enjoy the journey. He noticed other passengers smiling, sharing quiet conversations, or simply enjoying the view outside. He understood now how small acts of attention and kindness could ripple outward, influencing the atmosphere around him in ways he had not expected. The flight had become more than just a passage from one place to another. It had become an experience of shared humanity, shaped by the presence of someone who cared enough to notice and act with warmth. As the flight continued toward its destination, the cabin remained calm and pleasant. The man, now fully engaged in the moment, reflected on the experience. He had learned a subtle but powerful lesson, that small, thoughtful actions offered with patience and attention could transform ordinary moments into something meaningful. The flight attendant moved gracefully among the passengers, continuing to offer care, comfort, and connection, knowing that each small gesture contributed to a larger tapestry of shared human experience. The plane began its slow descent, and the soft hum of the engines shifted to a gentler, slightly more urgent tone as the pilots prepared for landing. The sunlight outside had started to soften, casting long golden streaks across the clouds below. Inside the cabin, passengers adjusted in their seats, pulled out their seatbelts, and prepared for the final moments of the journey. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with calm efficiency, observing quietly as she ensured everything was in order. She had a practiced eye for detail, but also for the small human moments that made each flight unique. The man who had once been deeply absorbed in his phone conversation now sat comfortably, his shoulders relaxed, a subtle smile on his face. He had put the phone away entirely, savoring the quiet in a way he hadn't expected. He glanced around at the other passengers, noticing their small gestures of preparation for landing, some stretching their legs slightly, some looking out the window, others quietly chatting. The flight attendant passed by him, her eyes meeting his briefly, and he offered a small nod of gratitude. It was quiet, unspoken, but full of acknowledgement for the care she had shown during the flight. As the plane tilted slightly, making the gentle turns necessary for descent, the flight attendant continued her rounds, checking on passengers with the same patient attention she had displayed throughout the journey. She helped an elderly woman adjust her seatbelt and offered a kind word to a young couple nervously glancing at the window. Her presence was calm and reassuring, a subtle force that contributed to the overall sense of safety and comfort in the cabin. She knew that her role was about more than just physical service. It was about creating a human environment where people felt seen and cared for. The man looked at the now empty tray in front of him and thought about how small actions had a profound impact. A simple piece of garlic bread served with genuine attention had transformed the mood of the cabin and his own experience. He realized that he had been too caught up in his own distractions, too focused on the phone conversation to notice the world around him. That moment of pause, that gentle interaction, had reminded him to breathe, to observe, and to engage with the environment and people around him. Nearby, passengers were quietly finishing small conversations or watching the clouds outside. A young child pointed excitedly toward the horizon, drawing a smile from their parent. An older couple exchanged soft words of appreciation with the flight attendant as she passed, and several passengers glanced at one another with subtle, shared acknowledgement of the calm and warm atmosphere that now filled the cabin. The man watched all of this quietly, noticing the collective shift that had occurred without any loud announcement or grand gesture. The flight attendant paused briefly at the rear of the cabin, scanning the rows for any last-minute needs. A young woman had dropped her book and she bent down to retrieve it, handing it back with a gentle smile. An elderly man looked slightly uneasy as the plane adjusted its descent, and she offered a soft word of reassurance. Each small interaction, though fleeting, contributed to the overall sense of care and attention in the cabin. She understood that these moments were the heart of her work, moments where human connection transcended the simple acts of service. The man reflected on the interaction he had with her earlier. He remembered how surprised he had been when she offered garlic bread mid-flight, how it had shifted his focus and how it had changed the way he experienced the journey. He smiled quietly to himself, appreciating the thoughtfulness and patience behind the gesture. It was a reminder that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, affecting not just one person but the collective energy of a shared space. The flight attendant began moving back toward the middle section, checking on passengers one last time before preparing for landing. She noticed how many people had relaxed, their initial stress and distraction softened by the subtle attention and care that had been offered throughout the flight. Even the man who had been deeply absorbed in his phone now looked fully present, engaged, and quietly happy. She knew that small, human-centered gestures were sometimes the most powerful elements of her job. As the plane began its final approach, passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. The cabin was filled with a calm, expectant energy, a mix of anticipation and quiet contentment. The man looked out the window at the landscape below, noticing details he had never taken the time to observe before. The subtle shifts of light, the patterns of roads and fields, the distant buildings that seemed almost miniature from this height. It was a moment of clarity, a pause in a world that often moved too fast, and he realized how rare and valuable such moments could be. The flight attendant moved gently down the aisle, her steps measured and deliberate. She offered a reassuring smile to anyone who seemed nervous, a soft word to anyone who appeared unsettled. Her presence was both professional and deeply human, creating a bridge between the mechanics of the flight and the emotional experience of the passengers. She understood that her actions, however small, had the power to transform the environment, to soothe nerves, and to foster connection. The man glanced at the passengers around him and noticed the subtle ways they had been affected by small acts of care. Smiles shared quietly, nods of acknowledgement, gentle conversations. He felt a quiet sense of connection with strangers, a recognition that even brief human interactions could have a lasting impact. He realized that this flight had been more than just a journey through the sky. It had been a lesson in awareness, presence, and the importance of small gestures that acknowledge the humanity of others. The flight attendant returned to the man's row for a final check, ensuring that he and the surrounding passengers had everything they needed. She asked if he was comfortable and if there was anything she could do for him. He shook his head with a smile, feeling content and appreciated. "Thank you," he said softly, not for the bread itself but for the thoughtfulness and attention behind the gesture. The flight attendant nodded gently, understanding fully that this acknowledgement was a recognition of human connection, not just service. As the plane continued its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin remained calm and warm. The passengers had shifted from individual focus and minor tension to a collective sense of ease and shared presence. The man watched the clouds and landscape with a sense of appreciation, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the way the world looked different from above, and the beauty that often went unnoticed in daily life. The flight attendant moved down the aisle one final time, offering reassurance and care wherever needed, a quiet anchor for the human experience of the flight. He reflected on the simplicity of the gesture that had changed his mood, the warm garlic bread offered with patience and attention. He realized that small acts of kindness often carried more weight than grand gestures or elaborate plans. A brief moment of care could shift a person's perspective, create calm, and foster connection. It wasn't just about the food, he understood now. It was about being seen, acknowledged, and treated with warmth and attention. The flight attendant moved back to her station at the front, completing her duties with the same calm, professional, and human-centered approach she had demonstrated throughout the journey. She checked equipment, secured service carts, and ensured that passengers were ready for landing. Yet her mind was also on the small, quiet victories, the moments of human connection, the smiles, the gratitude, and the subtle shifts in mood she had facilitated. These were the elements of her work that mattered most, the parts that transformed a routine flight into something memorable. The man glanced one last time at the flight attendant as she moved past. He felt a sense of gratitude not just for her service, but for the way she had transformed the experience of the flight. He realized that the memory of this journey would stay with him long after he stepped off the plane. Not for the destination, but for the simple human moments that had made him feel seen and cared for. Passengers adjusted their belongings as the plane prepared to land. There were soft conversations about the arrival, gentle laughter as children expressed excitement, and quiet acknowledgments of the flight attendant's work. The man felt a sense of shared humanity, a connection with the people around him that had grown organically over the course of the flight. The simple act of receiving care, the patience and attentiveness of the crew, had created a ripple effect that touched everyone nearby. As the wheels touched the runway, the plane moved smoothly along the tarmac, the cabin filled with soft expressions of relief and contentment. Passengers straightened in their seats, some exchanging quiet words of thanks with each other, and others simply taking a moment to breathe and process the journey. The man reflected on how the flight had been more than just travel. It had been an experience of attention, kindness, and subtle human connection that he had not anticipated, but would remember fondly. The flight attendant guided the passengers gently through the disembarkation process. She offered kind words, quiet smiles, and attentive assistance where needed. Her work, though often unnoticed in the rush of travel, had created an atmosphere that allowed passengers to leave the plane with calm, satisfaction, and a sense of human warmth. She knew that these small, thoughtful actions mattered far more than many people realized. The man stood up as he prepared to leave, collecting his belongings and glancing around at the passengers nearby. He offered a small smile to the flight attendant, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude and appreciation for the moments of care and attention she had provided. The flight attendant returned the smile, knowing that this subtle exchange carried the meaning of the entire journey, a recognition of human connection, kindness, and presence. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the man took one last look at the cabin. He realized that he had been given more than just a meal or a seat on a plane. He had been offered a reminder of the impact of small acts of care, the importance of presence, and the value of noticing the people around him. The memory of the garlic bread, the warm smile, and the patient attention of the flight attendant would stay with him, a quiet lesson in the beauty of human connection. The flight attendant remained at her station, observing the final moments of disembarkation. She reflected on the journey, the small gestures that had created a positive environment, and the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. The flight, now over, had become more than just a transfer from one place to another. It had been an experience of shared humanity, attentiveness, and subtle kindness that lingered long after the passengers left. The man finally stepped off the plane, feeling lighter and more aware than when he had boarded. The simple act of being noticed, cared for, and treated with warmth had transformed his experience. He walked toward the terminal with a quiet smile, carrying the memory of the small human moments that had made the flight special.